Okay. All right, Dr. David Stovall. So we are going to have an interview focusing on CRT praxis in schools. So if you could just start off by telling us your name, your current role, or your current position, and your role in contributing to Critical Race Studies in Education Association.
So I'm Dave Stovall. I am a professor of Criminology, Law and Justice and African American Studies at the University of Illinois at Chicago. And I am a founding member of the Critical Race Studies in Education Association. And that my current role is still a faculty mentor and participant in the conference.
Okay, thank you for that. Can you tell us a little bit more about how you, Dr. Lynn, Dr. Barry kind of came together and how CRT and Ed Association came to be?
So it was literally Marvin had an idea. AERA was in Chicago. The American Educational Research Association was in Chicago that year. So Marvin's idea was, man, we got all these folks who are coming to Chicago. We got all these folks who are coming to Chicago who also do critical race theory. So let's get a space after AERA where we can actually talk about some CRT issues and do it in a way that supports new faculty and graduate students. So the focus was new faculty and graduate students because there wasn't a lot of support, and there still isn't a lot of support for folks who do critical race theory and looking at critical race theory, particularly in education and schools. So it was a way to think about getting everybody in the same space for folks to see each other, to remind each other that we were not alone and that there were other folks that we could lean on in our network to support us as we move forward in doing CRT in education work.
Okay, thank you for that. Can you maybe talk a little bit about, you hit on this, the new faculty grad students. Why do you think that is? Why is it still such a challenge to get support?
I think the big thing around setting up support for graduate students is that we get caught into this kind of disciplinary conundrum, right? So if you're in curriculum, if you're in special ed, if you're in policy studies, if you're in ed psych, so all of the disciplines like to make a particular claim. And CRT is saying the claim in the study of race has to be interdisciplinary. So there's already tension in that. So now it's important for graduate students and new faculty to say, okay, if my work is pulling from various disciplines, now how do I talk about this in a trajectory that speaks to the work that I'm doing in the way that I'm doing it, right? So it actually pushes, and I think what we were able to learn from is really how folks like Danny Solorzano or James Anderson, and Danny Solorzano at UCLA and James Anderson at University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign were supporting folks who were intentional about their interdisciplinary take, but also very clear about the disciplines that they were pulling from. So again, it was all our way to talk about what are the ways that grad students and new faculty can develop clarity. Because if they don't have clarity, then you are subject to be victimized by not having that clarity. And what I mean by that is you'll either as a grad student be doing somebody else's work for them. As a new faculty member, you'll be pushed in these projects that aren't really connected to your work. So now what we were thinking about, and I think it's still important, is for grad students and new faculty to have that clarity, because in many spaces, they still want to couch us into single disciplines in opposed to thinking about what our work means interdisciplinarily. And I think that's going to be, I think, a question in perpetuity, but I think it's critically important to be able to do that. Where ethnic studies, gender and women's studies are a little far ahead of us, when we think about that work. But even there, there's still this kind of subtle push to the disciplines. So I think that interdisciplinarity is a critical stance that I think still has to be supported.
Okay. So can you talk then how CRT has played a role in your own scholarship and also in your pedagogy?
So for me as a graduate student, when I first heard about CRT, and I started reading the tenets because I was reading it in the law. And when I saw stuff like racism is endemic to life in the United States, literally my response was, for real, no shit, right? So now I had to think about that. And what really kind of brought me out of that conundrum was reading Eric Yamamoto, right? So Eric Yamamoto said this thing that just became tattooed in my brain. He said, we need to spend less time with abstract theorizing and more time on the ground with people experiencing the injustice. And for me, as a graduate student who was doing youth work at the time in a particular community, that made perfect sense. So it was this thing around, so of what use are these broad theoretical paradigms to the people who are experiencing this suffering, including myself, right? I can become dissonant and say that the academy is this kind of liberatory space, but that's a lie, right? In fact, that's excusing letting these injustices happen when at any given moment, it could be me. So Yamamoto was critical for me. And that came out into my practice in terms of pedagogy, because I'm perpetually asking the question of myself and my students, right? So why and for what, right? What are we doing this for, right? And if we are clear about what it is that we're doing this, why we're doing this, right? Then what's the work, right? So what is the work moving forward? If we've identified the issue and concern, now what is the work that we're doing to address that issue and concern, right? So I think that allows me to pull from ethnic studies, gender and women's studies, disability studies, community organizing, youth work, right? All of these spaces that require an analysis by which to frame the work, right? And for me, I'm always thinking about the framing of the work now allows us to identify the work, right? So if we have an explicit frame around what's actually happening to us, right now, how do we link with others to address that issue? So the CRT tenet in education talking about a commitment to social justice, and then the critical race praxis saying, well, we need to think about the material concerns, we need to think about the conceptual concerns, we need to think about the performative concerns, and then we need to think about the reflexive concerns, right? So this thing around from the concept to the material to the performative to the reflexive, now that allows us a pedagogical frame, right? So it's really, and it's not letting us off the hook. It's literally saying, okay, you've identified this. What are you doing, right? And now, based on what it is that you're doing, how are you willing to reflect to improve or cease what you're doing, right? Because sometimes in a reflection, you might have to say collectively, hey, this isn't necessarily what folks need. And then in other reflections, you can say, okay, here's how we need to improve the work. And I think another thing pedagogically, and I think this is what I've learned over now of 20 years being employed in the academy, that this is, the academy sells you the false trope of singular work, right? Where CRT stands in a very different position in talking about it collectively, right? So what is our work collectively, which is often antithetical to the academy, right? Because they want us holed up, boxed up in some cavern with a candle trying to do some work. And this thing around, it's us and folks like Kimberly Crenshaw reminding us, it is us that will keep us alive. So now we got to find us, right? So it's a different, so I think about my work in conversation with other work and part of a larger collective window of people who are trying to change conditions, right? And that was what the original CRSEA conferences were about. It was literally about getting folks in the same space to say, you're not by yourself. Here's what you can be doing. I think those are key points in informing how I approach things pedagogically.
So, okay, there's so much I want to unpack there, but let's stay with the praxis piece. So can you talk, so you kind of walked us through like conceptual, material, performative, and reflexive. So can you maybe give us an example of praxis in schools, either through your work or something that you've seen, something we should be thinking about specifically when we think about critical race theory?
Yeah, for me, I mean, I think about this in terms of, so the majority of my high school, my work has been with older young folks. So like anywhere between 7th graders to high school seniors. So that in terms of school-based work. I do some other work, but the school-based stuff is usually with that age group. So now for me, it's always thinking about, here's a group of young folks who have largely been alienated by schools, right? By this time, they are disgusted with school, right? So now, what is an act of solidarity with them, right? So think about going to a 7th grader saying, you should be disgusted with this. It's trash, right? And now, what are we doing now in recognition of that thing, right? So what is it, how are we now starting to think about our work? So if we go through the tenets of CRP, in terms of the praxis, it's this thing around praxis being action and reflection in the world in order to change conditions. So now if I'm thinking about materially, right, I'm sorry, conceptually, what is this thing that we're trying to do, right? And what skills are we trying to develop, right? So it's lesson planning without the curtailing and machinations and bogus requirements from the state, right? It's literally asking this question, what are we trying to do, right? What are we trying to develop? So for me, in classrooms, it's always around the development of a critical analysis to be able to see the condition and identify folks who you can work with to change the condition, right? So that's the concept. Secondly, what materials do we need to enact that vision, right? So this is if we need certain supplies, if we need software, if we need to train up on GIS, right? Geographic Integrated Systems, if we need to do some economic analysis, if we need to bring in a policy person, if we need to bring in a development person, right? So how do we utilize our networks to actually get the materials that we need to enact that concept? And then third, in terms of the performative, literally saying, okay, so now what are we doing in real time? We have the material. So now what are we doing in classes, right? What are we reading? How are we processing those selections? If we're having somebody who's a guest speaker, how do we develop critical questions? What are the practices and actions and exercises that we use in developing these critical questions? How do those become the assessments, right? Because we know assessment just becomes this open, empty word about somebody just being tested on something that you can regurgitate, right? But really saying, okay, well, here's something different. And now performatively, what are we doing in those classrooms to enact that concept of being able to have critical analysis of your conditions and being able to identify folks who are working to change them? How do we join forces? What is the material and performative realities that we engage to join forces with those folks, right? So it's a solidarity understanding, but for the purpose of changing the material conditions. And then lastly, in terms of the reflexive space, so what have we done that worked well? What have we done that did not work well? And what are we willing to do to improve that which did not go well, right? So I think those, for me, that's always the tangible example. And I oscillate between high school space and college university space in terms of that pedagogical approach to praxis, right? In terms of, because for me, it's succinct, but it also allows you to make adjustments to whoever your students may be, right? So this thing around being able to have that succinct understanding around what it is that you're trying to do, right? Because university space really rewards people who are not succinct, right? It's a bunch of pontification for no reason. So now, if you're just running your mouth about stuff, for me, critical race praxis says, okay, what are you doing, right? And how are you trying to make that make sense? Who are you trying to make that make sense for, right? And the answer can never be the academy, right? The answer should always be the people that you care about, right? So this thing around really thinking about that in terms of having that succinct understanding of the work and pushing how we actually engage it, right, from those four components. So that is, it's a very important guide for me.
So Dave, can you also say, so as you're talking, I'm thinking about not only the process, right, but in particular these power relations, right? So the fact that most of the communities, in particular the young folks that you're engaging and that I think many of us engage in CRT, are students that are already marginalized, are students that are already seen as problematic, as criminals, right, as disposable. And so how do you also kind of equip, and I mean, I think some of this comes with like the critical analysis and the conceptual piece, but how do we then prepare young people and or young scholars, right? As you said, the academy rewards individualism. The academy rewards this pontification. And so how do we also then equip our young people or our young scholars with the tools, whether it's analytical tools, whether it's some type of capital, so that they can finish their studies, that they can matriculate, graduate, and then go on to do the things they'd like to do? Because I know that some of this also gets us in trouble, yep, right? And that we can be, there will be consequences for this kind of ideology and for this kind of action, in particular in K through, I would say K through 16 spaces, right? So high schools and higher education.
Yeah, yeah. And I think for me, it's always, once you have decided to engage a justice condition, it is imminent that the opposition will come, right? So as, you know, folks say in Chicago, you know, when them boys come, things get hot, right? So that's an old adage. When the police come, now things get more contentious. So I think it's really around fugitive training, right? So this is like, this thing is, it's gonna come, right? So now how are we preparing folks for it to come, right? It comes in the form of microaggressions. It comes in the form of overt hostility. It comes in the form of passive aggressive behavior. It comes in the forms of these weird reviews of your work that make absolutely no sense, right? It comes in those forms. So we can't be thrown off by that, right? We now have to prepare folks for that. And I think it's really intentional. That's why that collective stance is so important, right? It's this thing around, you know, what folks refer to as an abolitionist stance or fugitive stance, right? So we're trying to get rid of those conditions that dehumanize us. And we're doing it in a way that are sometimes within the scope of rules, and in other times challenge rules, right? So this thing around really understanding that fugitivity, right? So I see CRSEA as an explicit attempt to develop fugitive space to prepare folks to engage that type of work, right? So I think for folks coming up in this, it's really this thing around understanding what is it that you're trying to do first, and then who are you trying to do it with, and then now you figuring out how you will enact those things, right? Because I think it's, we're doing folks a disservice when we do not engage them with the realities of this type of work, right? They're gonna come for you, period, right? There won't be as many accolades, you won't get as much love, and that is okay. Now, you gotta find the folks who understand what it is that you're doing, right? It's an organizing principle, right? You gotta find your folk, because if you don't, this thing will kill you, right? I mean, and I think that's the fugitive equation, that is the praxis equation, that's also this collective responsibility, right? So we can't be dismissive of that, because the academy tells you that, you know, the first thing they say to you, this won't get you tenure, right? Or why are you doing it with that group of folks, right? There's always around this devaluing, right? And with younger folks, it's this thing around saying, look, the lie that we want you to believe is that it is impossible to change your condition, right? And to do it collectively, right? But now to say, okay, the opposition is coming, right? We expect them. In that expectation, now here's what we're going to do, right? Because it's not about being surprised by this, but it's really around understanding, you know, what folks would say in the larger world is understanding a people's struggle, right? A people's struggle against oppression, a people's struggle against these things that are intended to dehumanize and rob us of our capacity to change that condition, right? Because that's how white supremacy operates, right? White supremacy operates in a way for you to first devalue yourself, right? And if you devalue yourself, now it's ingrained and it becomes easier for you to devalue others, and more importantly, others that look just like you, right? So this thing around really being intentional about that, right? How do we now raise up against those spaces that are intended to do those things, right? So now I think it becomes important for training folks up to be able to think about this. So I always think about teacher ed programs around, what if teacher ed programs were situated around training up cadre to work collectively in addressing issues and concerns, right? And this comes in the form of, you know, sharing curriculum, looking at each other's pedagogy and practice, asking deeper questions, things that have been done historically. But I think now it's really on us to look to those strategies that may be deemed antithetical to the individuation that's rewarded in the academy.
Okay. All right. Yeah, again, so much I want to unpack. So staying with the praxis in schools, I guess, before we kind of go anywhere else, is there anything else in terms of praxis, specifically critical race praxis, that grad students, emerging scholars, folks who are just coming into the field, any other concepts, tenets that you think we really need to be aware of?
Yeah, I think a lot of praxis, because they're very succinct, those 4 tenets are very succinct. I think it's important to pair them with other theoretical components, right? So if we think about Sojorner and Yosso's components of CRT and education specifically, right? So if we pair those with it, if we look at people's struggle of the global South, so now, and then community organizing strategies, right? Gender framings and understandings, right? So I think our praxis is not this static thing. So CRP is not meant to be static, right? CRP is a frame by which to talk about how you are moving in the world trying to enact a justice condition, right? So, we got to we got to understand what abolitionists are talking about. We have to understand what fugitive space is, right? It's those things that actually push us to now start to think about these things. And it's something that the legal scholars reminded us, right? CRT is nothing new, right? But it's a naming to remind us of what it is that we're in, right? And I think that to me, that becomes the most important, because everything in this hyperbolic society pushes us away from remembering and understanding what it is that we're in, right? A moment of perpetual white supremacy, right? And now, how do you work to interrupt those ideologies, knowing that to be the case, right? So I think those, to me in particular, our praxis orientation is now saying, what are we in solidarity with theoretically and materially? And then how do we, and what are the ruptures, right? So we have, this isn't, fugitive space, fugitive work against white supremacy is not always sanguine, linear space, right? This is not necessarily cause and effect. It's this thing around what's all the messiness, where are all the muddles? How are we now starting to think about our work collectively, right? In terms of where it stands. And departures aren't necessarily a bad thing, but now how do we engage in pushing us to think about our work moving forward? So I think that's the praxis orientation, right? It's always around what are we doing, but how are we informed by what has been done, right? In terms of not, because our praxis cannot be ahistorical. That is a tragic mistake if we make our work ahistorical.
So I just really want to reiterate, and I'm really appreciating that you're talking about CRP is not being static. And I think, again, that's something that the Academy really pushes, right, on scholars, is this cause and effect model, right? That it has to be this very linear kind of movement. And so I just really want to underscore that this work is messy, that this work takes time, it takes collectivity. And I think that's something, again, I'm not sure how, I guess what you were saying, these reminders that we have to keep reminding ourselves and keep reminding those that are coming into the field, right, that this will be an ongoing battle. And in particular, I've heard a lot of folks talk about, not getting the recognition, right, for the work that they're doing. And so we're reminding ourselves that the Academy is not the space where you're going to find this recognition, right? That the recognition will come from your collective, that the recognition comes from the folks that you're working with, and that it looks very different, right, than what the Academy kind of provides for accolades. Okay, so I want to stay with some of the tenets or concepts that you have talked about. And I know we were talking specifically about praxis, but are there any other specific tenets of CRT or conceptual models or frameworks that we should be thinking about, or I should say that you use to drive your own work?
Yeah, I mean, I've been really thinking about my own work as kind of fugitive work, right? So really kind of reading Black radical feminism and the challenge that has been raised by Black radical feminism, right? Whether it be the Combahee River Collective, Sylvia Winter, whether it be the new iterations of young folks coming into it, like your Brittany Coopers, Eve Ewings, Bettina Loves. So kind of thinking about Lee Patel, right? What does it mean to enter this work? Understanding that fugitivity, right? In terms of really saying that, some of these non-reformist reforms may come by way of using some particular structure, right? Other abolitionist strategies say, well, we need to think about why do these things even exist, right? And if we operate from an abolitionist perspective, us saying we need to ask deeper questions, right? And this kind of thing gets me in trouble, right? Because I've started to engage this thing around saying, you know, if school in its material and ideological form was never really meant to educate anybody, then what are we doing, right? So, and can we operate from the point, so can we have abolitionist visions of the school, right? And can we ask a deeper question around, can school be a place where education happens, right? Because they're two different things, right? So this thing around really, and that's not necessarily a new question, right? It's rehashing an older question and saying, okay, well, what does this actually mean, right? Because like Bettina Love's work points out, we've had these teachers who have operated from an abolitionist perspective. They've said explicitly, my concern is not with the school. My concern is with you being in the world and making those decisions in the world that will improve your condition while not harming other folks who look just like you, right? So this thing around really kind of thinking about that push. So I pair that, those abolitionist visions, those fugitive visions, along with, and what's deeply informed by Black radical feminism in terms of what the work is moving forward. So it's really around asking those, for me, those deeper questions, right? And how, you know, liberation struggles in the global South, right? Whether it be West, Central, Southern Africa, whether it be Central America, whether it be Southeast Asia and the South Pacific, right? So all of these spaces where people have made these attempts over the years to engage each other and think about what are these conditions for liberation. And I think that's for me, critical race praxis paired with critical race theory in education while looking at the legal construct is also pushing us, and the legal construct of critical race theory, pushing us to say, we're speaking to a lineage of work, right? And these iterations are allowing us to understand that lineage, and it's able to push us, right? To now think about what our work can potentially be.
Okay. I think you answered my next question, which was making connections to the field of it, to the larger field.
Mm-hmm.
And I think you just addressed that. So you've mentioned a lot of different folks that you have read, and I know that you're in community with. So can you tell us a little bit, because let me just do a quick step back here. I think that many times that when folks come and hear from critical scholars, just such as yourself, that there is this forgetting that you too, right, did work to get to where you're at. And so if you could talk a little bit about the role of mentors in your work, right? But then also how you see yourself as a mentor. And I don't know that you would call yourself a mentor. I would call you a mentor, but how do you see that?
Yeah, I think in a couple of ways, and I had some very explicit examples of that, right? So for me, one of those first examples was James Anderson, who was my department chair as a graduate student. And the way he framed the work of graduate school and really being explicit around why you're getting clear around what it is that you're doing, like that to me was a critical lesson, right? And then somebody like Larry Parker, who put me in contact with Danny Solorzano, and going out to UCLA and seeing what he's been able to do over the last 30 years in terms of creating collectives of people who did that work as a graduate student and still do that work, right? So I had this wild kind of revisit experience where Danny does this research apprenticeship course, so he calls the RAC, and I've presented in the RAC twice. And I remember coming to UCLA, and I was literally in a meeting with Marvin Lynn, Rob Teranishi, and a couple other folks whose work I still use and still am in contact with, right? So these people I've known for 20 plus years because of this work, right? And folks like Denise Taliaferro-Brazil, who was part of the first CRSEA iteration, but we knew each other as grad students, and then being able to see what they were doing to support other folks. And then asking a question, what does it mean to do two things for me? One, build the bridges, and now work based on the bridges that you've built, right? So this thing around and being able to serve as a resource for folks because folks did it for me, right? And just really kind of thinking about that continuous responsibility, right? How do we support other folks, because we won't be here forever and we can't get into founder syndrome, right? So this thing around, we have to be able to push the work forward. There is a deft responsibility to push this work forward and to do it beyond our personal selves, right? So this thing around, how do I support folks in those relationships, whether it be as a PhD advisor, whether it be as somebody who's doing K-12 work, or whether it be just rando cat, me as just rando cat in Chicago on the street, right? I mean, but this thing around being able to make this make sense for folks because someone made it make sense for me, right? It's not doing anybody any good for me to just hoard this information, right? It doesn't make any sense, right? So now, what is that distribution, right? So now, what is a distribution of time, energy, and resources, right? And time, space, and will, right? So how do we start to think about that, whether it be the people's education movement that originated out of California that, has some iterations in the Midwest, or folks who are doing teacher education work in California, New York, and building with them, right? Or kind of a newer collective of folks who are doing like carceral studies, prison abolition, and saying, what does it mean to bring those concepts into K-12 education? Because we've been thinking about them, but our silos only allow us to do certain things. And I think observing, especially somebody like Danny Solorzano, who has been able to really think about interdisciplinary work, I would argue, in a very different way in terms of CRT, and then paying attention to a Kimberly Crenshaw, who has now really pushed us to begin to think about how intersectionality plays itself out, but what does it mean to have a real intersectional lens around looking at what it is that we're trying to do, right? Not just random terms, but, and then, observing, the big homies like Gloria Ladson-Billings, right? Who was quintessential in advising us in those early stages of CRSEA, right? And saying, okay, you all need to be thinking about this. How are you supporting folks? What are you doing? Because the people who came through her, I still work with, right? Whether it be Adrienne Dixon, Tonica Chapman, all these folks who are coming out, and I see those things largely as these collective realities. These aren't folks that we just kind of getting up with to, party and dare we say bullshit with, right? But this thing around saying these are folks connected to real work. And now how do we start to build that out, right? So for, doing collective work with folks like Patrick Kamayan or Carolina Valdez, Veronica Velez, right? So all of these folks who I've met over the years, right? Yolanda Seeley Ruiz, right? And, you know, the young homies, Eve Ewing, Bettina Love, right? All these folks who have now enriched me actually from older groups or peers. Like, so in working to develop a high school, I leaned heavily on Jeff Duncan Andrade and Wayne Yang's work, right? So, and knowing them, right? Ernest Morrell, Tyrone Howard, right? All of these folks, not as a name drop, but to say, here are the folks who have actually informed how I do things, right? So it's not just this, it's not superficial, but it's really thinking about what are we using, right? And seeing the new folks come up, right? You know, whether it be Ed Kumarang, right? Shireen Hennigan Martinez, right? All the folks, Steph Cariaga, right? Like all these folks who are coming into the gate, who are pushing us to do certain things, and people who are not afraid of engaging in that way, right? So like even Thea Berry's work around pushing really what Adrienne Wing was talking about in critical race feminism, right? So really being intentional about that. So I always feel like one of the duties and responsibilities that I have is to support folks and to build those necessary bridges, because I see those connections, right? And to just make those connections. That's however fraught that comes out, that is what I'm trying to do.
So can you say, David, I'm biased. Let me just start there, right? Obviously, because you are and served as my mentor at UIC. But part of the reason we decided to do these videos is that there are so many either junior scholars, graduate students, right, who do not have the mentoring, who do not have the support, who do not see their role or do not see the academy as a tool, right? Kind of what you've expressed throughout this interview for liberation, right? And so really thinking about what does that support look like? So can you talk a little bit more about some tangible, like what does that mean? Because I've heard so many horror stories from graduate students, right? About kind of this hazing process that happened. Right. And so how do we start for maybe those who see this as normal, right? I'm thinking of the CRT tenets, right? How this becomes ordinary, right? This is how the academy functions. And so we just kind of feed into it. And so I know I've been I've had a very different trajectory because I've gotten mentoring from folks like you and many of the folks that you've mentioned, right? Being at UIC. And so what does that process look like? Or what are some maybe tangible characteristics that you can say, like, this is what it looks like and how it's different from the traditional trajectory? Right.
I think one of the things that's critically important, I think it's important to say, right, we can't look to the university for any salvation, right? I think that's just important to say, right? It's a mechanism that may allow you to deliver some material resources to some work that you're doing that's largely external to this space. So what we're talking about, I largely find external to this space, right? So to the university space, because it's really around, to me, it's a type of fugitivity, right? Some things are within the constraints and confines, most and many are outside, right? So I think one of the things in terms of, if we think about materially, right, just kind of going back to CR critical race praxis, right? I think this thing around questioning rigor, right? I don't have to beat the shit out of somebody to know that they understand what it is they're trying to talk about, right? What we really want to do is have a clear articulation of what it is that you're doing. So materially, we need to be asking the question, why and for what? So when somebody comes to me and says, I want to get a PhD, the second question I'm asking is, why and for what? And do not answer that because you're talking to me. I need you to be able to answer that for yourself. Because if you got a random, bogus, broad answer, do not do this. It is bad for your health. right? And just being clear about that. I think another thing materially is to be willing to share those resources. I mean, what the hell is the use of having this rando bookshelf behind me if I'm just gonna keep the books? What is it? Looking at a statue? I mean, it makes no sense, right? This thing around how are there things in these resources that can be shared with folks, right? So how do I make this accessible? So for faculty who are moving into advising roles with students, how do you make this stuff accessible? And then getting folks in contact with folks who may do work from a more radical perspective, right? And I think there are two parts to that, right? Because a lot of times people think of that as networking. That is not what I'm saying, right? We're having a networking social. No, right? That's not where I'm going with things. But I think about it in terms of saying, what is it that you're trying to do? And then for folks in the advisor role, don't put people in contact with folks who you know are not going to reply, right? So this thing around because it's a thing with academia, right? People will write some really hella critical stuff, and then you meet them in person and they're assholes, right? So this thing around being like, look, who's not going to front on this student who's coming up in this? So if I'm putting them in spaces, I'm not putting them in spaces where I know they will be harmed, right? I'm trying to put them in contact with folks who are doing work and are willing to support folks. I've learned valuable lessons from folks like Ruth Nicole Brown, who takes a radical Black feminist approach to the performativity and healing work of Black girls, right? So she's so intentional about offering support to folks, right? And in that intentionality, I learned valuable lessons in terms of follow through. And I think that third thing, having some follow through, right? So being able to follow through on things, right? If you fall short, admit that you've fallen short. But I think that capacity to follow through with what it is that you're saying, because if you do not have capacity to do those things, it is important to state that you do not have capacity, because I don't want to send folks down on another road that's going to further send them off, right? And be very clear about what you can and cannot support, right? And even in that, you fall short, but this thing around being very clear that you may have fallen short, right? So being very humble and honest about your capacity. I think those things we can tangibly do in terms of operating in any type of advising role, any type of support role for graduate students and new faculty, undergrads and high schoolers, right? So thinking about that in real ways. And I guess another thing that comes up, and I take this approach, don't ask anyone to do anything that you're not willing to do yourself, right? Just simply, right? You don't have to, because that's always, you're making these asks sometimes on folks. I'm seeing this happen to people, like, these people are making asks because they don't even want to do it themselves, right? So now I think a way of cutting that down is asking yourself that reflective question.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Thank you for that. So this will be my final question, I hope, because the thing is you talk and then I want to ask more questions. So any advice for junior scholars, grad students who are looking to use critical race theory, or more specifically, critical race praxis in their research or in their teaching?
Yeah, I think for the graduate students, use your time as a graduate student to develop clarity on what it is that you're trying to do. And ask yourself whether or not something like critical race theory in education, critical race theory in the law, critical race praxis in the law, critical race praxis in education is allowing you that clarity, right? Does it inform your clarity? And I think that becomes critically important, because as you move to faculty positions, that clarity is going to steer you free from the white supremacist logics that get you into those forms of self-hate and doubt, right? So evil wins because it can incur doubt, right? And your clarity is how to alleviate doubt, right? And now being able to link with folks who have also expressed that clarity, right? Because the logical space that the academy operates from, and Denise Taliaferro Brazil always puts me on this thing around, there is this idea around rationality, right? And the rationality is this is an individuated space for people to do very individuated work. They get some accolades on this work, some rewards, but your best bet is to keep it individuated. Where I think critical race theory, critical race praxis, any type of intersectional, interdisciplinary study actually is saying we have to push the boundaries because those singularities have further imprisoned us, right? So now being clear about what it is that you do, what you pull from, and how you're moving, and being very explicit about finding that support. Be as committed to find that support in opposed to this individuated work, because that support is the space that will keep you alive, right? And I think that becomes, and I think a last thing in, getting through this in ways that are still healthy is to be overcommitted to the spaces that bring you joy in opposed to the spaces that bring you despair, doubt, and hatred, right? I mean, just very explicitly, right? Because there's a way that the academy and the logics of white supremacy have a weathering effect, right? They beat on you slowly until you're in dysfunction. So now you got to be proactive on the front end to secure those spaces of support and, dare we say, joy, right? That are completely antithetical to what the academy is asking you.
Okay. Thank you. I think I needed to hear that today.
Done.
Anything else that you want to share in terms of your work, in terms of CRSEA, CRT, with folks out in the world trying to navigate, systems specifically who are really trying to center unfortunately, right, the endemic nature of racism that is persistent throughout K through 12, K through 16, and really in society?
Well, let me say publicly and on tape that I am extremely humbled and thankful for folks like yourself who have continued the work. And I feel as if it is my responsibility to support the work moving forward. I think CRSEA is an example of people engaging in a fugitivity and saying that there are things within the rules that do not meet our needs, and that it was the will of folks saying, well, here are the things that do meet our needs, and here's what we will do to enact those things. And I'm thankful for folks seeing the importance of continuing such a vision.
Thank you, Dr. Stovall. I appreciate it, and we appreciate your time. So I think that is our last question. I'm going to stop this.